Hey guys, again, a lot has happened since we last talked. I mean, we've got a new US UK trade deal, a new pope. I think Bernie's got a new beard as well, which we're
Yeah, yes, a beard in motion anyway.
All very exciting developments for everyone involved.
We have had some listener interaction, which we love hearing from you guys as what you want us to talk about. Bernie, over to you.
We do. We have a question from Graham about the US-Mexico border. Graham asked, although Trump campaigned on building a wall along the border, it appears there's been no significant developments or funding for this proposal in the first 100 now and plus days. Do you think this leaves Trump vulnerable to criticism from his core power base, his core supporters? That's an interesting question because there actually hasn't been much. There's been no, we haven't heard much about border wall construction, and the government, the White House is still asking for funding both for border security and for internal immigration enforcement, which they hope will come soon, but it's something they're pressing for. But at the same time, the border remains kind of probably among all the different issue areas that Trump has focused on in this first few months. It's probably the one in which he's still strongest. He consistently points to a very, very significant reduction in the number of people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, and I just had a recent look at the statistics, and it is kind of in the upper 90% compared to where we were previously, and certainly at the height during the Biden administration. There's no wall per se. I mean, there's no physical new construction of the wall per se, but there's a wall of a different kind in terms of just for example, the National Guard deployments. We've seen kind of a militarized strip along the border in kind of western Texas and part of New Mexico, which has been really quite successful in terms of kind of stemming the flow of people coming across. So really, it's if anything for his supporters, that'll probably be one of the areas in which he's been most successful, I would say.
Yeah, and it made me think this question about the fact that, the border wall was such a feature, wasn't it, of his first term in office? And yeah, we haven't obviously talked much about it, but the point of the border wall was about border security. And as you said, Bernie, this is a place where the Trump administration has the receipts to show it's been very successful. We've seen the number of illegal crossings, unlawful crossings, as you said, drop dramatically. And that is something that the Trump administration is very keen to point out. So you could say, the method that they use to stop unlawful border crossings is less important here, the wall itself, and the number is far more important.
I think as well, those policies are actually acting as a greater deterrent than physical structures can or ever could. I mean, I was down in Arizona at the border there just a couple of weeks before the presidential election, and we looked at sections of wall that had been built under the first Trump administration. Huge, impossible to scale them. Efforts had been made to dig underneath, but again, they went quite far down in this particular section. But at the point that the wall stopped, everyone just walked around and came through that way. And yes, there were agents there, but this was what the acts of the people desperate to come to America. It was like, I will come through here and hand myself over and then become part of the system, which again, President Trump is also tackling with some of his policies. But it feels like they've kind of realized in the administration, I mean, to you guys' points about how we don't hear so much about the wall anymore, it's like they've realized that these other policies, this extreme hardline approach about deporting people to countries that they have no connection to without any due process, actually is more effective in stopping people coming over than, building sections of wall ever could. And I mean, I do think they still have plans to carry on that building subject to funding. And it's kind of been very casually referred to as part of Doge, hasn't it? That they are trying to find these funds to channel back into sort of other projects within the administration. And I think the first environmental regulation that was rolled back actually was to allow sections of wall to be built in California. But even since that happened, which I think was about the beginning of April or so, the number of people coming over has really dropped so significantly there that there's a question whether you should be spending taxpayers' money on something that isn't needed in the same way anymore.
As you said, I do think they will, pending funding, build it, if only for the purpose of having something that one can see, that they can show the American public, here is a wall, and it's kind of a literally a concrete example of what they're doing, because the imagery of stretches of desert or rivers in which people aren't crossing isn't particularly kind of television friendly for the American public that he's trying to reach. So I do think we'll see some of it. But even people who are in favor of stronger border security have always said if you build a 10-foot wall, people will come with 11-foot ladders. So I think the messaging has kind of turned more domestic in that it's become much more difficult to live here without documents as it was in the previous administration, or in previous administrations in plural.
Asylum policies under the Biden administration in the first few years, at least, were far more generous. And that's one of the reasons that we saw. I mean, I remember being at the border in California where you saw so many people from literally countries across the world, from Africa to Asia to Latin America, of course, who said they were coming in to claim asylum here in the US, and from countries that are not considered countries where they would be persecuted. And we have now seen those who, for example, tried to use legal pathways in the Biden administration using the CBP app to make an appointment to be able to come into the country and then seek a pathway towards getting a status to stay in this country, that many of those people have been told to leave the country as well. So, it is that atmosphere, as you said, Bernie, of the situation once you get here with the deportation program, but also just the difficulty of not necessarily crossing the border, but finding any sort of ability to cross and stay, that I think is really having an impact.
I think, to the point about the atmosphere in the US at the moment, I mean, even here in Washington, D.C. this week, 8 or 9 restaurants were raided by ICE agents, Immigration Customs Enforcement team, asking people for their paperwork, for their documents. I have small kids. I'm in various parent groups. There's all kinds of messages there about ICE agents stopping nannies and children while they're in playgrounds in various parts of Washington, D.C., asking them for their paperwork. There's potential for them to turn up at school gates as well. That's another thing that's being discussed. And that's just, in this city, which wouldn't necessarily be a hotspot. There aren't so many trades here in this city for people maybe without paperwork to get employment in. There aren't the big construction sites. There aren't farm workers and so on. But I think all of that messaging is going back to the countries that people are so desperate to flee from and have a better life for themselves and their families and their children. And it's a very different approach than we saw in previous administrations, where there have been individuals dispatched. I mean, obviously Kamala Harris was one in the Biden administration, dispatched to countries to try and improve things at the source before people left to travel to America. But that hasn't proven to be as effective as the policies that this administration is engaged in.
No, but I think at the moment, the kind of unspoken part here is that Mexico's government in particular is in a very difficult balancing act with the US because of the looming issue of tariffs. So we have seen kind of Mexico's government do more to kind of stem the flow of migrants much further south from the border in southern Mexico, on the border with Guatemala, for example. And in the past, that's proven to be kind of probably one of the most effective ways to reduce numbers at the border. We saw that during the Biden administration as well, when Anthony Blinken went to Mexico City, and then there was a deployment of Mexican troops and National Guardsmen on their southern border, and it led to kind of at least a temporary reduction. So in that regard, I think kind of the pressure that the Mexican government's facing from Trump as a result of tariffs, and also kind of the fentanyl issue that is kind of Trump is hanging over their heads most of the time, is kind of been very effective in kind of pressuring them to stop those people long before they ever get to the US.
We're also seeing the administration offering $1,000 for migrants to self-deport back to their home countries. And the administration says, when they do the calculation, that it's far cheaper for migrants to take this option, that they would buy them a plane ticket and give them the stipend, essentially, of $1,000. And their calculation is that it costs about $17,000 for ICE agents to apprehend someone, and then to the process that leads to their deportation. So it just gives you a sense of the policies as they're working here in the US, what the administration's perspective is.
I wonder, though, how many people will actually sign up for
Yeah.
that, because, I mean, we don't have any firm details of how that will operate. I saw something about how you would have to pay for the ticket yourself and then claim the money back. A, will you ever see that money? And B, if you declare that you are here illegally, undocumented, without paperwork, and that you're going to leave, do they let you leave like that of your own volition, or
Yeah.
are you rounded up to become another statistic? Or if you say this is my address, that they make a guesstimation that perhaps there are other people there who aren't self-deporting. You know, I think I'd be really interested to see if they make figures available on how many people actually sign up for that.
I actually find it quite telling because at the White House a couple of times, Tom Homan, the border czar, has been there, and I've asked him how many people. Now there's an app called CBP Home, which is
Mm.
essentially used to you could use it to self-deport. It was previously used for asylum claims, and then they rebranded it. I've asked them a couple times how many people have actually registered using this app, and there's been no firm answer. And more recently, I was looking at some Mexican government figures of the number of Mexican citizens who have been deported back to Mexico, which is, the largest number here in the United States, and it's in the tens of thousands, which sounds like a lot, but when you look at it as a whole, it's actually not that much. And remittance figures of people sending money home to Mexico haven't declined very much at all from what I can tell from the statistics. So I mean that shows that there's still a lot of work to be done from the administration standpoint. I think they're very much, this whole campaign is very much in its infancy still.
And there are bipartisan calls still for more money for judges, more money for facilities, and so on. And I mean, that's kind of making its way through the Hill as part of President Trump's big, beautiful tax bill that he's trying to get passed.
Yeah, it is really interesting to see that. As we talk about what the administration sees as its big success, it is also very much banking on this big, beautiful tax bill to see through much of President Trump's agenda as well. It's at the moment around $4.5 trillion in tax breaks and 1.5 trillion in spending cuts. The problem is that within the Republican caucus itself, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, there is not agreement on many of the points of this bill. So, what it would do, or what President Trump wants to do, obviously, is extend the tax cuts that his administration put in place in 2017. They would expire, and he wants these extended. Obviously, important for voters, and an important message that Donald Trump had made on the campaign trail to say, these tax cuts will continue for all Americans. But there are real concerns over a number of issues, and you're starting to see some of the more moderate Republicans, centrist Republicans, really opposing efforts to cut Medicaid, for example. You've seen a number of them raise the issue that in their home districts, they have a number of constituents who depend on Medicaid. And there's also this big difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives on just how much they want in cuts. So on the House side, you have the further right House Freedom Caucus that wants to see huge amounts of cuts to the federal budget, and less so on the Senate side. So it makes you wonder. They had the Speaker, Mike Johnson, had set Memorial Day as a goal to get this bill through and get this bill done. It is looking pretty difficult right now.
Which, just to say, is the end of May for non-American viewers and listeners.
And it's going to be very politically challenging for him because the numbers are so narrow in the House side, and I think I was reading today that there's 64 Republican members in the House whose districts have a much higher than average enrollment in Medicaid, which and not all of them are necessarily kind of moderate Republicans, but that is kind of, if even some of them kind of oppose this, it becomes very challenging for Mike Johnson to kind of whip up the necessary support among the Republican base, and I think that's going to be the challenge going forward. But also, I think it's difficult for Donald Trump because he's, in a way, boxed himself into a corner about the tax cuts, because he repeats it as often as he can that tax cuts are coming very soon, and he's left himself very little wiggle room to maneuver if there is kind of extended issues on Capitol Hill.
You know what I found really interesting here is we're talking about, a band of moderate Republicans in contest with the Speaker of the House. And usually when there is difficulty on the Hill, we're talking about the hardline Republican faction not rolling in with the rest of the party. And it's a really interesting kind of point about how polarized this country is at the moment, that Republicans who are in blue states mostly are really pushing back on some of these issues because, again, they've an eye on the midterm elections next year and aware of how the economy, as we've talked so many times on this podcast, is probably going to be once again the defining issue, particularly if, from those who are interested in immigration's point of view, President Trump may have appeared to have solved that issue, if you like, from that perspective. But the economic issues, the fallout from the tariffs and so on, is really going to be one for those Republicans who are in blue states. And particularly what I thought was interesting is like what could be perceived as quite a small issue, which is about being able to write off a certain allowance from your state taxes, against your federal taxes. There's a cap of $10,000 on that for individuals or married couples to be able to write things off. And again, just to explain very briefly and very basically for our non-American viewers and listeners, that you pay taxes in the state where you live, but you also pay federal taxes. So you have two sets of taxes to pay each year, and you can offset one against the other. But those in blue states where the incomes are higher want that cap of $10,000 to be raised because you're paying much more than $10,000 in your state taxes, that you want that write-off on the federal taxes. And the rest of the Republican Party, or those who are in states where the income is a lot lower and don't have big, huge cities like in New York, like in California, have no interest in changing that cap because it's not something that's going to play with their voters.
If they were to raise the cap on that, there is a bit of the sense that it's pitting those people who live in, rural areas or in states, in red states, mostly that don't have to deal with these issues that you do in a New York State or California. That's pitting them against, the rich liberals in blue states like California and New York. Even though we're talking about Republicans here who want to see this cap raised.
And I certainly think as the election kind of gets closer, we'll hear much more of the rhetoric about coastal elites, even within the Republican Party, which will be very different than the way we heard about coastal elites, quote unquote, in previous elections, where it was kind of implied that coastal elites were liberal. But it just goes to show that the United States isn't as necessarily kind of two-party as it is on paper. I mean, there's definitely factions within the Republican Party and factions within the Democrats, and I think we'll more and more we'll see that play out with what happens with the economy and the administration.
But until now, whenever there's been a crunch in the House of Representatives in particular, Donald Trump has resolved it. You've seen him make, direct calls to members of Congress. And when the Speaker of the House, who has a difficult job with these factions, as you said, Bernie, within his caucus, when he has been in a tough spot, you've seen the president come in and convince any holdouts to go the way that he wants. And I wonder if this might be more difficult because of those midterm elections coming up. It could be, that they do get it resolved in the last minute, very likely. But right now, there's a gulf between them.
At the same time, I think part of his kind of power and sway over the party is that he kind of sees himself, and some lawmakers see him as kind of a kingmaker, and that if he came out against a particular candidate, that might spell the end of their political future. So I think a lot of people will be very careful in what they say about him and his policies and how they kind of those things kind of intersect, just because they don't want him to come out against them in the future. It's he really does have a lot of kind of sway with voters still. So I think people will be quite concerned about that in the long term.
What I've also been watching, though, in the last week or two is the amount of power that he does seem to wield to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the Secretary for Health and Human Services. He seems to have huge respect for, Bobby, as he calls him. But some of the cuts that he's pushing through really are continuing to really work up the medical community in this country. I mean, we heard about a lot of them at the start, all the layoffs, cutting of research grants, shutting down departments within the National Institutes of Health. One that I noticed this week that's been shuttered is the Back to Sleep campaign, which is an anti-cot death campaign, basically telling parents to put their children on their backs going to sleep, not to fall asleep with the child on you, in the bed with you, and so on. A campaign that started in 1994. So that's how long it's going. And in the first year or so, I've been speaking to some experts about this, it reduced the number of cot deaths in this country by 50%, which is massive. It's been very successful ever since. the number of cot deaths has started to rise in this country in the last year or two, which medical experts put down to kind of COVID and a post-COVID period where people didn't have access to information in the same way. So that's one program that's gone, that's causing extreme alarm amongst pediatricians. Obviously, we've seen a reduction in information around vaccines as well. Also closed this week was the office that's in charge of kind of public information campaigns. Again, people will remember from the pandemic. I know we hate remembering back to the pandemic, that nightmare period in everyone's lives, apart from baking bread or whatever. Telling people to wash their hands, to wear masks, basic hygiene stuff. You remove all of these information campaigns and you have quite a potential impact on public health. And also the Ready to Learn program, which is what's responsible for Sesame Street, which so many Americans grew up watching, that's gone too. So, quite a number of these programs that are so instrumental in raising this country's infants and children and youth are gone. And it's quite hard to know what the long-term impacts of those are going to be. But according to the professionals anyway, really, they could be quite serious.
We spoke to Massachusetts governor last week about the cuts that are also being made on the research front to the National Institutes of Health, for example, or public health bodies like the CDC. And taken all together, there are real concerns, especially among Democrats in Congress, who really see this as a big blow to public health and will really reduce the US's readiness for any future pandemics. So, I wonder what the Trump administration will do to kind of address some of the concerns about these programs and this funding going away. And at the same time, to your point about RFK Jr.'s influence, really fascinating to hear him talk about the new Surgeon General pick. So they had a pick for the Surgeon General who it looks like some of her qualifications had perhaps been misrepresented. So they nominated, or the Trump administration nominated a new pick, Dr. Casey Means. She's an influencer. She did go to Stanford, where she got a medical degree, but then didn't complete her residency. And she is someone who 100% ascribes to RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again campaign, and also his opposition to the pharmaceutical companies and big agricultural kind of companies as well, saying that they are responsible for chronic disease that we see in this country. But interestingly, when he was asked about this at the White House, Donald Trump was asked about nominating Dr. Means, and he said, well, I did it because I got a recommendation from Bobby Kennedy. Bobby told me she was good. And that just underlines your point, Caitríona, that he does seem to have a lot of influence.
And the person who he is no longer putting forward for Surgeon General, Jeanette Nashwaiwat, is Mike Wall's sister-in-law. So we know Mike Wall's not in favour anymore, out the door. Kind of interesting that a week later, his sister-in-law is also removed from her post, or potential post.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of fascinating part about that is, when Waltz left, we discussed the potential influence that Laura Loomer, the far right activist, I guess one could call her, had on Waltz's departure. And now she's very explicitly claiming credit for what happened with the Surgeon General position and Dr. Nashwaiwat stepping away. She's claimed it in her own words as a scalp. And we keep hearing kind of whispers of how much influence she might have and what people's concerns about that. But it is really interesting. She's both claiming to have got rid of Waltz and the Surgeon General. Trump hasn't spoken about it, and we of course don't know any firm details. But Trump certainly in the past has respected Laura Loomer's opinion and has said as much.
It'll be great to read all the books that come after this administration, as happened at the end of the first Trump administration. And you learn so much about those power and influence games that go on behind the scenes, or in front of the scenes sometimes as well. But we are, I think, at time for today. So much more to talk about, as always.
Well, great to see you guys again.
See you guys soon.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and do leave us a comment below.